ruin to reunion. Andrew tells us of a visit. I can just about remember it. We did the first competition in 1995, the second in 1997, and just recently we've had our 20-year reunion on site, and so that's why the title. If I just press. And what's it all about? Well, we have a series of visitors to the museum, about 1 million a year, and Nefertiti, here in her unrestored state, a workshop which produced heads of this character and represented the Prussian nation's fascination with Cairo and the Nile and the history of that whole civilization. In Cairo in 1832, the city established their Museum of Egyptology. In 1845, the Emperor of Austria visited Cairo and bought the whole lot and took it back to Vienna, where you can see it today. So the ambition of the King Frederick William IV of Prussia was to, shall I say, emulate, or in a way say, we too need an Athens of the North. And so this is Gilles' sketch of that idea of taking the island in the middle of the Spree in very much the same way as Notre-Dame is in the island in the middle of the Seine, to build not only a cultural centre, but also to link that to the Altars Museum, to link that to a museum which symbolised the culture of the island, with his castle, with the cathedral, and eventually with a collection of 5 museums. Here you have the Altars Museum with this remarkable staircase, which is within the colonnade of the building, designed by Schinkel, looking out onto Lustgarten, and then beyond that, the castle, the Schloss, now being reconstructed. Over to the east is the cathedral, and behind us is the Neues Museum. So this is the first multi-storey building in Europe, multi-storey museum building in Europe, and it's made as a multi-storey building because the collections of the Prussian state grew so rapidly from the empire which they were able to draw on for the collections. You see here it's not a stone building, but it's a rendered building with a brick back face, and it has on the skyline the zinc sculptures which are very special to Berlin. Internally, Stüller uses the staircase that you saw Schinkel use looking over Lustgarten. So you have this idea of a landscape which is both of the exterior and the interior. And the staircase survived with all those frescoes destroyed in the fire. And if I can just do the next one. This is the post-1943 ruin after the RAF had bombed Berlin, and this is the Egyptian courtyard, and the ruin had been created by war. The Russians had come through from the east and attacked the building in a very vociferous and aggressive way. The GDR, the poor East German economy, was not able to repair the building, and so it stood as a ruin for a very long time. And this is what Andrew describes. I don't think he quite saw it like that, but it is improvisation, just sheltering the artifacts of the museum. And this period from 1943 to 1988 was a period of putting over a temporary roof, excavating and archaeologically saving and salvaging material from the museum, and also Wolf Hense and Michael Asselmeyer did all the documentary research, which meant that when the competition was established in 1995, the archive material was available to the project. In Berlin, there was a lot of spare space. There were a number of airfields, and so the architectural collection was sent out to airfields and just stayed like this for 40 years. Here are the works of art, and you can just see the salvage is a fairly crude, utilitarian, but necessary salvage. It's not all beautifully wrapped as we would today. Internally, this is the entrance to the lower of the three museums, the vestibule, and I just want to touch on the ceiling and the ways in which we looked at preserving it. On the right, you've got the stone column, and then between the wall, the far wall, and the beam which sits on top of the column, you've got a grid of what appears like metalwork, and indeed it is. It's zinc casings, and behind that zinc casing is a cast iron beam. The cast iron beam was provided by the British. The cast iron was made here and then transported by river up to the island. And in the Great Fire, which had followed the bombing, water had been poured onto the structure, and that had cracked the cast iron. And our task was to think what we might do. So this is the reflected ceiling plan, and it would have been an option to take it all down and rebuild it. But over the top of that were about 10,000 tesserae, all laid as a pavement. So we sought to find ways to re-establish the stability of those cast iron beams in behind the zinc casings. This is a closer look at the zinc casings, and you can see the decay of the brick and pot coffers between the structure. This is a section through, and there you can see the simple cast iron beam with its central reinforcement and the casing around it, from which the masonry was built. At Karlsruhe University, we made some cast iron replicas. We made them from poor iron to match the original mix, and we put a carbon fibre tape underneath so that even though the beams were fractured, we could leave them in place. The museum itself is built of domes and ceiling coffers, And it's a day-lit museum, so each one of the galleries is very narrow, side-lit, and this shows the original display of classical furniture and classical artifacts. That is made up of these pot floors, and Schinkel and Stuller came to see Soane at the Soane Museum and went to Manchester to look at the mills there, because when they'd built the brick structure of the museum, they built it without all the floors, and it sank by about 400 millimetres into the silt of the river. They were therefore looking for this lightweight pot floor construction, and Soane was building the Bank of England at the same time. And we've sort of considered how we were going to justify the floor loadings to the museum, who were, well, like the Museum of London now, asking for, could we have 10 kilonewtons, please? The answer was no, you can't. We were told that these pots are totally unavailable. They're just a flower pot with an end, so they're a cylinder of clay, and they're turned on a wheel, and you raise it, and then you close the top with a little. You then put a pinhole in to release the gas during firing. And so I went to a potter in Petersfield, and I had 3 or 4 made, and then brought them in carrier bags to the table at the museum where everybody was sitting around, and they said it's impossible, so I put them on the table. And then suddenly there was a rethinking, and they thought, well, perhaps we could do what the Brits could do. And sure enough, 20,000 pots were made by 2 men, and we still had to say, well, we can make the pots, but can we prove that the floors can actually carry the load? So we built a test vault, and it failed at 22 kilonewtons. So we thought, well, we can provide you with 5, and that is remarkable from such a thin, aerated series of mortar and of clay. You can see in the corners you get the brick triangulation to take the compression in the corner of the vault. I was just the previous slide showed some of the great chambers which were within the ruin where floors had collapsed, and so we had to repair pot vaults but also renew whole floors with pot vaults, and you do it in the way the Romans did. You put up a timber frame and you lay the pots over, infill them and so on. This is the plan of the museum, and you can see that you have the Treppenhalle, the staircase in the centre. You then have a courtyard on east and west, and then these single aspect galleries going round. And one of the first decisions we made was that the circulation pattern of the original museum should be re-established. The Egyptian courtyard was destroyed completely on 2 sides. So on the right-hand side, the west side, and behind me on the north side, there was no wall. So re-establishing the circuit of the galleries meant reconstructing new galleries in place of the old to re-establish the courtyard. Within the courtyard, there had been, as an earlier slide showed, this Egyptian temple. And the idea that we brought forward was the idea that we should re-establish that, and beneath this plate of floor, there would be a space which replicated the framework of the original. On the left-hand side, you had surviving painted decoration, which gave, and that was given a context by the size of this space. It's obviously roofed over, and both courtyards were roofed over in order that they became part of the circulation space. And David's conceptual sketch of just that space. I don't think he's got the columns quite slender enough. So the southeast resolute in the foreground, the bombers came in from the southeast, so that was completely destroyed. And then I've been showing you the white area at the top of the picture where a large portion of the building was destroyed. The underpinning by the GDR had provided us with a much simplified problem, so that it meant that our new foundations and old foundations were not at differential levels, so that you didn't get the stress between different parts of the building. And the lash-up of stabilising the building, I just wanted to touch on the fact that the shortage of materials in the GDR meant that we had, as you see, Acro props, which are somewhat tenuous, intended to lift the load of these collars clear of the structure and not put stress on the domes. Okay, but how do you disassemble it and actually make it work properly? What I did like was this wonderful sort of timberwork. I really like the combination of timber structures supporting masonry, which is in distress, rather than steel. And I would say that we underuse timber in temporary works. Externally, we had this typical German scaffolding system, and in some ways it's very inflexible because you get the lifts where you get the lifts. On the other hand, it's very easy to put up and put down, and I think we had it up and down about 5 times during the 10 years that we were working on the project. And that is in contrast to the problems we have today with the great scaffold structures that you have to put up, and then those force you to perhaps spend more money than you should be on the existing structure. And then what to do with the surfaces. On the bottom left is, if I can just get that. On the bottom left, that's what we start with. And then we say, well, how can we begin to represent the cultural survival? And so we perhaps say, well, we need to plaster it. And maybe then there needs to be some balance brought between the existing and the new repair. That leads on to, during the underpinning of the building, on the lower picture you can see the hard engineering brick, which was used to stabilize the ruined parts of the building and try and give some of the planes back their stability. We show on the top our proposal to take that material out and put in new second-hand bricks in a lime mortar. Again, this was a problem where second-hand bricks don't have a DIN standard, so I brought 5 architects to London and we sorted bricks for a happy couple of days. And then they went back to Berlin, and there were no second-hand bricks in Berlin, we were told, until they found 2 million of them, and then we were able to repair the building with second-hand bricks. This is one of the interiors, the interior of the Egyptian collection originally, and you see these little white splodges on a painted ceiling. That was because in 1929 the Amana collection came to the museum, and a false ceiling was put in, as you can see, below the coffers. And so on the walls you have the Amana decoration, and then above you have the previous decoration. And so what we were able to think about was, how could we bring those two together? So we kept the ruin of the Amana decoration at low level with its false dado, and then you can see above the remnants of the decorative scheme for the figures chopped in half at their waist. On the left-hand side, you've got the new structure, and of course the proposal was, why can't we have a new concrete building? But I said, we've got these bricks, aren't they rather nice? And so it was resolved that we would build the building to the same geometry of the surviving right-hand portion of the building, the southern portion. We would establish the window pattern to be the same. And on the cornice, we would incorporate some of the stonework which we'd salvaged and we knew came from the demolished wing. At the same time, the right-hand side is rendered as ashlar, and it's to represent Silesian sandstone. Each block has a sand rubbed into it so that you get a pink and a beige and a grey, to as I say, to give that sense of a rendered building being stone. On the left-hand side, we decided that that sort of Butterfield ascent to heaven would perhaps be represented by a series of horizontal bands which gradually got broader as they went up the building. Obviously the render was of various qualities, and that's the analysis which is exactly what you would anticipate. Where there was bare brickwork in the white portions, we decided that we would repair the brick, and then we used a series of slurries to actually cover it, not with a render, but it was like representing the first coat of a 3-layer render system, so that the tonal value of the surviving material and the tonal value of the brick were not in contrast, but were actually harmonized architecturally by drawing the same material together. And if I just show you how we did that. So this was the original material, and you can see top right and top left, bare brickwork. And so we looked at, well, how could we just take some of the patchiness and build it back into representing an architectural whole from which you could read material. And that was the means in which we established a strategy towards the repair of the surfaces of the building. It all had to be approved by about 23 people, and so it was very necessary to argue one's way through in a rational way. The three-dimensional works of art, again, armatures clad in mortar, And extraordinary when you're working on sculpture at that height, it has to be almost grotesquely crude in order to read at ground floor level. And so we didn't have a screen on the scaffold because the sculptor would do work and then walk to the other side of the river to see if it looked right. And so we come back to Gilles, and I agree that everything is in the right order, the frames are all the right size, and they can have warranties for all this Anglo-Saxon repair that we've imposed on them. Thank you very much.